In the frozen heart of Chicago, under the glow of Christmas lights, a man who was believed dead lay inside a coffin, his wife weeping, his city mourning. But at that moment, it wasn't a doctor, a detective, or a priest who first sensed the truth. It was Rex, a 7-year-old German shepherd, barking with a desperation that shattered the silence of St. Mary's Church. They thought he was mad with grief, but what if his cries were not chaos, but a warning from God? What if loyalty itself became the miracle that pulled a man back from the grave? Tonight, we unravel the story of betrayal, hidden power, and the faithfulness of a dog who refused to give up. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you believe loyalty still saves lives, and write Amen if your heart is ready for this journey. Have you prepared a cup of ginger tea or coffee? Because you will need it as we walk together through every twist until the very end. Chicago lay buried beneath a white silence, snowflakes drifting under the glow of Christmas lights strung across frozen streets, and the heavy bell of St. Mary's funeral home tolled solemnly into the cold air. Inside, the scent of pine garlands mixed uneasily with polished wood and candle wax, a deceptive warmth against the bitter winds rattling the stained glass windows. Rows of pews were filled with uniformed officers, their medals catching the glow of flickering candles as they gathered to honor Chief Robert Dawson. The city's most respected lawman had been declared dead from a sudden heart attack 2 nights before, and his funeral fell cruelly close to Christmas Eve, when the city longed for peace and hope. Chief Robert Dawson was 60 years old, a towering figure even in death, lying in a mahogany coffin lined with ivory silk. He had broad shoulders and a military posture that had commanded respect without words, steel gray hair trimmed neatly, and a face carved with years of fairness and battles against corruption. Even now, his jaw looked strong, lips pressed into a faintly resolute line, as if refusing to surrender to death completely. He had built his reputation as a man of integrity, someone who would never bow to political pressures, and that reputation brought half of Chicago to his farewell. Near the front row, his wife Sarah sat in quiet devastation. Sarah Dawson was 56, a tall, elegant woman with auburn hair streaked with silver, pulled into a low bun that trembled slightly with every movement of her hands. Her slender frame was wrapped in a black wool coat buttoned tightly against the cold that seeped into the room. Lines of both kindness and grief carved her pale face, and her hazel eyes, though rimmed with tears, still carried the depth of someone who had spent a lifetime teaching children patience and hope. She had been a third-grade teacher for nearly 30 years. Life had never given her the child she longed for, 3 miscarriages etching scars of sorrow deep inside her heart. But she had poured her motherly love into her community, into her husband, and into their German shepherd, Rex. Rex was 7 years old, a powerful, sable-coated German shepherd with intelligent amber eyes and a muscular frame that still carried the discipline of his days as a police K-9. One ear tilted slightly to the side, damaged from an explosion during a drug raid years earlier, leaving his hearing compromised, but his instincts sharper than ever. Since his forced retirement from the force, he had become the Dawsons' family companion, protective, loyal, and inseparable from the chief. Today, however, his presence at the funeral was not that of a grieving pet, but something far more primal. As the minister's voice droned through prayers of eternal rest, Rex suddenly stiffened. His fur bristled, his hackles rose, and a low growl built into a fierce, echoing bark that shattered the solemn quiet. His barks bounced violently against the vaulted ceiling like a siren in the night. People gasped. A few startled women clutched their purses, and officers shifted uneasily in their seats. At first, they thought it was grief, the poor animal losing control in anguish. But Rex's body trembled not with mourning, but with urgency, as he fixed his gaze on the coffin. Deputy Chief Alan Brooks reacted first, his face flushing a shade of red that matched the holly berries strung across the walls. Brooks was 49, trim and meticulous, with carefully combed blonde hair and a politician's smile that rarely reached his cold blue eyes. His uniform was immaculate, every crease perfect, his gold badge polished brighter than the star on the Christmas tree that flickered in the corner. For 8 years, he had been Dawson's second-in-command, always competent, always ambitious, yet never loved like the chief. Rumors in the department painted him as a man who valued career over loyalty, someone who spoke smoothly in public, but wielded harshness in private. "Get that damn dog out of here," Brooks barked, his composure slipping as Rex lunged forward, claws scraping the polished wooden floor. "This is a funeral, not a circus. Show some respect." 2 younger officers hurried to restrain the German shepherd, gripping his leash, but Rex's power overwhelmed them. He broke free with sudden, explosive force, surging toward the coffin. Floral arrangements toppled, roses scattering like spilled blood across the floor. A collective gasp rippled through the mourners, the sound of outrage and fear mingling with the chaos. Sarah covered her mouth with trembling hands, torn between grief and shock, whispering her husband's name as if calling him back from the coffin. Watching from the 3rd row was Detective John Miller. At 46, Miller had a weathered face that told the story of a man who had seen too much, creases etched deep around his eyes from both laughter and grief. His dark brown hair was streaked with silver and cropped close to his skull, his jaw square and roughened by a day's growth of stubble. His blue-gray eyes retained a sharpness, a detective's watchfulness that missed nothing. Miller had lost his wife 3 years earlier to ovarian cancer, a wound that had hollowed his home and left him clinging to work for meaning. He had served with Dawson for over 2 decades, and their connection was more than professional. It was personal, almost paternal. As a troubled 16-year-old arrested for theft, it had been Dawson who gave him a second chance, taking him home for dinner instead of sending him to juvenile detention. That night of meatloaf and mashed potatoes had changed the course of his life. Dawson had told him, "You've got good instincts, John. Trust them, even when no one else does." Those words echoed now as Miller leaned forward in his pew, heart hammering as he watched Rex tear at the silk lining of the coffin with his teeth. The dog was not mourning. He was alerting. Miller had seen Rex at crime scenes before, trained to signal danger or evidence, and the behavior was unmistakable. Yet no one else in the room seemed to understand. To them, it was a disgrace, an animal humiliating the solemnity of Chicago's most honored officer's farewell. The minister dropped his Bible in shock. Sarah whispered, "Oh God, what is happening?" Brooks rushed forward, his voice sharp with fury, ordering the officers to drag the dog out. But the scene had already shifted from sorrow to near panic. Some guests stood, unsure whether to intervene. Others muttered that the dog should be sedated, that grief had made it moped. Only John Miller remained utterly still, eyes locked on Rex, and a cold realization began to dawn in him. The German shepherd's growls deepened, his teeth ripping harder at the coffin's lining, refusing to be pulled away. Miller's instincts screamed louder with every second. Something wasn't right. He could feel it in the icy draft that swept through the hall, in the tremor of Sarah's hands, in the hollow chill of Brooks's too perfect composure. He rose slowly to his feet, one hand raised. His voice, though quiet, cut through the noise like a blade. "Wait," he commanded, the word sharp enough to freeze the officers mid-motion. His eyes never left the coffin, his gut tightening with an instinct he had learned to trust long ago. "Open it! Open the coffin, now!" The room fell into stunned silence, broken only by Rex's desperate, relentless barking. Dozens of eyes turned toward him, some wide with horror, some burning with outrage at the audacity of his demand. Brooks spun on him, his jaw tight, fury trembling under the surface. "Detective Miller, have you lost your mind?" he hissed. "This is a funeral. You'll desecrate the chief's memory." But Miller didn't flinch. His voice came colder now, steady, almost haunted. "No. Rex isn't grieving. He's warning us. If we don't open that coffin right now, we might regret it for the rest of our lives." The minister's lips parted in silent protest. Sarah's tearful eyes darted between the coffin and Miller, torn between faith and fear. The officers hesitated, uncertain whether to obey the deputy chief or the veteran detective. And in that moment of unbearable stillness, the only sound was Rex's growl, low and unyielding, as if the dog alone knew the terrible truth hidden beneath the polished mahogany lid. Rex's barks grew sharper, louder, echoing like thunder rolling against the vaulted ceiling of St. Mary's funeral home. His jaws snapped at the silk drapery hanging from the mahogany coffin, tearing at it with such ferocity that scraps of fabric fluttered across the marble floor. To the mourners gathered in the dim light of flickering candles and snow-muted windows, it was no longer grief they witnessed, but madness. Murmurs spread through the crowd like wildfire, whispers of sacrilege, of disrespect for the chief's memory, of an animal so overcome by sorrow that it had crossed into violence. Sarah Dawson pressed her hands to her face, her slender frame trembling, auburn hair streaked with silver slipping loose from its careful bun as her shoulders quaked with silent sobs. At 56, Sarah had always been composed, a teacher who kept classrooms of restless children in order with little more than a steady gaze. But here, before the coffin of her husband, her control shattered. In her heart, she believed Rex had turned against the man who had once been his master, as if even the dog refused to accept Robert Dawson's sudden death. And that belief twisted the knife of grief deeper into her chest. Across the aisle stood Alan Brooks, his pale face mottled crimson with anger. He thrust out his arm toward the officers wrestling with Rex's leash, his sharp jaw clenched so tight that cords stood out in his neck, the practiced calm of his politician's smile broken apart. "Enough!" he shouted, his voice cracking against the silence. "Remove that animal now! This is a disgrace!" Brooks's cold blue eyes darted to Sarah for approval, expecting her nod, but the widow sat frozen, torn between sorrow and confusion. Alan had always been meticulous, his blonde hair combed with military precision, his uniform a study in order. But beneath the surface of control lay a man desperate for power, desperate to ensure that chaos never exposed weakness. To him, Rex's behavior was not warning, but threat. Threat to the dignity of the funeral, threat to his own image before the city's cameras, and indeed, there was a camera. At the back of the room, standing on her toes to catch every angle, was Grace Mitchell. At 45, Grace had the sharp presence of a woman who lived on deadlines and headlines. She was tall and lean, her long black coat pulled close against the winter chill, dark hair cut in a blunt bob framing a pale face with green eyes that missed nothing. She had worked for the Chicago Tribune for nearly 2 decades, building her reputation as a relentless investigative reporter, though her cynicism had hardened with each story of corruption ignored, each exposé smothered by powerful hands. Divorced, childless, she had poured her life into her work, carrying both its pride and its bitterness in her posture. Now she raised her phone high above the murmuring crowd, recording the chaos. The loyal dog tearing at its master's coffin, the widow sobbing in humiliation, the deputy chief screaming for order. In her mind, the headline was already forming. Hero's funeral descends into shame. Chief's dog disrupts ceremony. It was sensational, and it was cruel, but cruelty sold papers, and Grace believed sentiment had no place in journalism. John Miller remained apart, his weathered face tight with a storm of memory and instinct. At 46, his blue-gray eyes narrowed with suspicion, his square jaw tightening as he weighed every detail. He had seen Rex at crime scenes, seen the way the animal responded only when something was wrong, and what he saw now was not madness but urgency, as if the German shepherd were clawing at the very truth itself. Yet Miller's voice was drowned by the rising tide of misunderstanding. Officers pulled harder at Rex's leash, muscles straining, boots sliding on polished marble as the dog lunged again, nails screeching across the floor. Sarah whispered through her tears, "Why, Rex? Why can't you let him rest?" And the mourners nodded, pity in their eyes but judgment in their hearts. To them, the animal was dishonoring the dead. The minister, a frail man in his 70s named Father Daniel, stepped forward, his wrinkled hands trembling against the Bible pressed to his chest. His white hair was thin, his skin pale as parchment, but his voice, though cracked, carried the authority of decades at the pulpit. "This is holy ground," he declared. "We must restore peace to honor the departed." He gestured toward the doors, signaling for Rex to be taken outside. To Father Daniel, trained in ritual, death was a passage not to be disturbed, and the sight of the dog's violence shook him to his core. But Miller could not let it pass. He strode down the aisle, his dark overcoat swirling behind him, boots echoing across the hush of shocked mourners. "Wait," he said again, louder this time, his voice rough with urgency. He fixed his gaze on Brooks, then on Sarah, then on the minister. "You're all seeing grief, but I'm telling you, Rex is alerting us. He's trained to signal danger. Something is wrong with that coffin." The reaction was immediate and hostile. Brooks rounded on him, his blonde hair gleaming in the candlelight, his words like ice. "Detective Miller, you're out of line. You disgrace the chief's memory with such madness. Sit down before I have you removed." His eyes flickered briefly, almost nervously, toward the coffin, but his anger smothered the flicker before anyone else noticed. Grace Mitchell lowered her phone, intrigued. Miller's defiance sparked something familiar, the scent of a story beneath the story, the possibility that chaos was not what it seemed. Her reporter's instinct, dulled by years of cynicism, sharpened for the first time in months. She zoomed closer on her lens, recording Miller's face, the veins standing out on his neck, the haunted conviction in his eyes. If he was right, this could be something far larger than a sensational funeral headline. Sarah, caught in the storm, clutched the edges of her coat. Her hazel eyes darted between the coffin and Miller, between Rex's growls and Brooks's fury. She wanted to believe her husband was gone, to bury him with dignity, to end the ache that had swallowed her since the night she found him lifeless on their couch. But the doubt Miller sowed lodged deep. What if Rex wasn't mad? What if he was trying to tadav Robert even now? The thought both terrified and electrified her. The murmurs in the crowd rose into arguments. Some demanded silence, others cried for respect, still others whispered conspiracies. Had the chief truly died of a heart attack? The tension snapped like ice cracking on the Chicago River. Brooks barked an order. Two officers seized Rex's collar, dragging him toward the side door. The dog snarled, his teeth bared, his eyes burning with desperation. His paws clawed at the air as if refusing to leave. Miller moved to intercept, placing a hand on the coffin itself, feeling its cold, polished wood beneath his palm. "Open it," he said again, more firmly, staring directly at the minister, then at Sarah. "If I'm wrong, you can bury me with him in disgrace. But if I'm right—" His words trailed off, the weight of them heavy in the still air. The room froze, every eye on Sarah Dawson. Her thin frame shook, her pale lips parted. For a long moment she said nothing, torn between tradition and instinct, between love and fear. Then, with tears sliding down her cheeks, she whispered, "Do it." The minister faltered, looking to Brooks. Brooks's jaw flexed, fury and something darker flickering behind his cold eyes. Grace held her breath, recording, her pulse quickening with the possibility that the story she thought she was writing had transformed into something much more dangerous. Rex suddenly fell silent, his ears forward, his whole body poised at the coffin as if waiting for the moment of truth. The funeral director approached with trembling hands, his keys rattling faintly. He bent over the coffin, fumbling with the brass latches. The mourners leaned forward, their disbelief heavy in the charged silence. Brooks's voice cut through like a blade. "This is outrageous. You'll regret this, Sarah." But Sarah, pale and tear-streaked, lifted her chin for the first time since the service began, her voice thin but firm. "He was my husband. If John Miller is right, then I'd rather face the truth than bury a lie." The final latch clicked open, a metallic sound that seemed to echo through the room louder than the bells outside. The funeral director's hands trembled as he began to lift the lid. Rex let out one final sharp bark that rang through the chamber like a gunshot. And then, before the lid could fully rise, a dull, unmistakable sound emanated from within the coffin, a faint, hollow thump, like a fist striking from inside. The heavy brass hinges groaned as the lid of the coffin lifted, and the dim light of the funeral home spilled across the chief's still form. The air felt charged, the silence almost suffocating, broken only by the faint rattle of the funeral director's breath as his trembling hands steadied the lid. For a moment it seemed that all doubts would vanish, that they would find only the cold certainty of death lying within. Yet as the crowd leaned closer, straining to see, John Miller's sharp blue-gray eyes caught the smallest movement, the shallow rise and fall of a chest that should have been still. His heart slammed against his ribs. Robert Dawson was breathing. Gasps erupted from the mourners. Sarah staggered forward, her pale face drained of color, her long fingers clutching at the pew for balance as tears blurred her hazel eyes. Her auburn hair slipped loose from its pins, falling around her shoulders, the fragile dignity she had carried shattering under the weight of shock. "Robert," she whispered, her voice breaking into a sob that seemed to carry through every corner of the room. The funeral director, Mr. Samuel Whitaker, froze in disbelief, a tall, gaunt man in his early 60s, with thinning gray hair and deep furrows across his forehead. Whitaker had overseen hundreds of burials. His manner was usually calm, professional, as cold and practiced as the marble floors beneath his feet. But now his sunken brown eyes darted nervously to the deputy chief, his skeletal fingers twisting together. "This "This is not possible," he muttered, his professional facade crumbling into raw fear. Alan Brooks's face hardened like stone. His cold blue eyes widened for the briefest instant before narrowing again with calculated restraint. His blonde hair, perfectly combed, now seemed almost too immaculate, as if mocking the chaos around him. "This is absurd," he snapped, his voice ringing with false authority. "A mistake, some reflex. The man has been examined. He's gone." His words were loud, confident, but his jaw trembled beneath the surface, betraying a ripple of panic. Father Daniel, his frail frame stooped in his white cassock, staggered backward, clutching his Bible tighter against his chest, as if it could shield him from the impossible. His weathered face, creased from decades of ritual, twisted in horror. "The dead do not rise," he whispered hoarsely, though even he could see the faint pulse fluttering at the side of Dawson's neck. Rex barked again, triumphant, his amber eyes gleaming as he rose onto his hind legs and placed his paws against the edge of the coffin, tail whipping with desperate insistence. For him there was no mystery, no confusion, only the truth that his instincts had screamed all along. John Miller forced himself forward, pushing past the frozen line of pallbearers. His square jaw was clenched tight, his stubble-shadowed cheeks drawn with grim determination. He leaned over the coffin, pressing 2 fingers against Dawson's neck. His breath caught. There it was, faint but steady, the fragile beat of life that no one else had expected to find. The memory of Dawson's voice thundered in his mind. "Trust Rex's instincts, even when no one else does." Sarah collapsed onto her knees beside the coffin, reaching trembling hands toward her husband's still face. "He's alive!" she cried, her tears streaming freely now. "Oh my God, he's alive!" Her long body bent protectively over the man she thought she had lost forever. The strength that had carried her through 3 miscarriages and decades of quiet resilience flooding back into her as hope ignited. The crowd erupted into chaos. Some shouted for an ambulance, others screamed in disbelief, still others muttered darkly that it was a trick of the body, some cruel scientific deception. Grace Mitchell had not stopped recording, her green eyes wide behind the glow of her phone screen, her reporter's instincts roaring with adrenaline. The story she thought she was chasing had exploded into something larger than any headline she could have imagined. Her lips parted in a whisper only she could hear. "This changes everything." At that moment, a new figure pushed his way through the stunned mourners. Dr. Elizabeth Carter, the county's medical examiner, arrived in a flurry of determination. She was 38, with dark hair tied in a tight bun, rectangular glasses perched on a sharp nose, and an analytical gaze that pierced through confusion like a scalpel. Her white coat flared open, revealing a simple navy sweater beneath, her lean frame radiating competence. Known for her precision and refusal to bow to political pressure, Carter had earned both respect and resentment in equal measure since arriving in Chicago 2 years earlier. "Step aside," she commanded, her voice steady, her brown eyes scanning Dawson's body with clinical efficiency. She pressed her stethoscope against his chest, listening intently, then looked up with stark clarity. "He has a pulse. It's weak, but it's real. He's not dead." The shock in the room deepened. Sarah let out a sound between a laugh and a sob, clutching her husband's cold hand, whispering his name again and again. John Miller exhaled sharply, relief flooding through him, though his detective's mind was already racing ahead to the darker question. If Dawson had not died of natural causes, then what had really happened? Alan Brooks's composure slipped further. His lips tightened into a thin line, his eyes darting toward the doors as if calculating an escape. He cleared his throat, his voice tight. "Then explain this," he demanded, his tone laced with contempt. "If he's alive, why did the paramedics declare him gone? Why was there no heartbeat, no breathing? This is impossible." His words carried the weight of doubt, but his body betrayed fear. Dr. Carter straightened, pulling a small penlight from her pocket and shining it into Dawson's sluggish pupils. "Not impossible," she said coldly. "Unlikely and suspicious. This man shows signs of chemical suppression. I'll need to run tests, but my preliminary judgment? He was poisoned with a compound designed to mimic death." She glanced toward Miller, and something unspoken passed between them. A silent confirmation that this was no accident, no miracle, but an attempt at murder. Grace's pulse pounded in her ears. She filmed everything, but for the first time in years, she felt the weight of the story pressing down on her conscience. This wasn't just scandal. It was conspiracy, something that could shake Chicago to its core. Her green eyes flickered toward Brooks, catching the quick twitch of his jaw, the faint sheen of sweat beginning to glisten at his temples. Sarah squeezed her husband's hand again, her tall frame bent protectively over the coffin. "Who would do this?" she whispered, her pale lips trembling as she turned her tear-filled eyes toward John Miller. Her voice carried both terror and determination, as though she already knew the answer, but could not bear to speak it. Miller stood straighter, his square shoulders rigid, his gaze narrowing on Brooks for just a fraction of a second, before he turned back to Carter. "Get him out of here," he ordered, his voice rough but steady. "He needs to be in a hospital immediately. And until we know what's in his system, no one, and I mean no one, touches him except Dr. Carter." Alan Brooks stepped forward, his jaw set. "You don't have that authority, Detective." His cold blue eyes glittered with suppressed rage. "I'm the acting chief now. I'll decide what happens." Miller's eyes hardened, the weight of his past with Dawson burning behind them. "Not tonight, Alan. Not over his body." The room vibrated with tension, the air itself taut as a wire about to snap. Before Brooks could respond, Rex let out another bark, sharp and insistent, his amber eyes snapping toward the side doors of the funeral home. His ears pricked, his muscular frame tensed like a coiled spring. John Miller followed the dog's gaze, his breath catching as the doors creaked open. A figure stood silhouetted in the icy draft that swept in from the snow. A tall man in a long, dark coat, his face shadowed beneath the brim of a hat. He did not move forward, only lingered in the doorway, watching the chaos with unnerving stillness. For an instant, Miller thought he saw the glint of recognition in the man's eyes. Cold, calculated, waiting. Rex growled low in his throat, his hackles raised. Sarah gasped, clutching Dawson's hand tighter. Brooks turned, his expression tightening, and for the first time that night, Miller thought he saw not anger in the deputy chief's eyes, but fear. The man in the doorway tipped his head slightly, as though acknowledging a secret known only to him, and then, without a word, he turned and vanished into the falling snow outside, leaving the funeral home in breathless silence. Snow swirled in heavy sheets against the ambulance windows as its sirens wailed through the silent streets of Chicago, lights flashing like urgent beacons in the winter night. Inside, the world felt cramped and electric. Chief Robert Dawson lay strapped to a gurney, oxygen mask pressed tightly over his face, monitors flickering with fragile signs of life. His chest rose shallowly, fighting with every breath. Dr. Elizabeth Carter, her dark hair pulled back and glasses reflecting the pulse of red and blue lights, hovered over him with steady hands, though her sharp brown eyes betrayed the urgency she fought to suppress. She had found the puncture mark on his neck only minutes earlier, a faint bruise where a needle had slipped into his skin. It was enough to shift the narrative from tragedy to crime. John Miller sat beside her, his square jaw locked tight, stubble shadowing his cheeks as his sharp eyes followed every flicker of Dawson's heartbeat on the monitor. His broad shoulders hunched forward, the exhaustion of years of policing mingling with a raw determination that tightened in his chest. Rex, the German shepherd, sat at his feet inside the ambulance, his thick coat damp with melted snow, amber eyes fixed on his master's gurney. The dog's body trembled not with fear, but with tension, as if his instincts told him the battle was far from over. Sarah Dawson clung to the side rail, her tall, slender frame swaying with the motion of the vehicle. Her auburn hair, streaked with silver, fell messily around her tear-stained face. She whispered her husband's name over and over, her long fingers brushing his cold hand, her voice cracking under the weight of disbelief. The hope of his survival had replaced grief with fragile terror. Each shallow breath he drew a promise she feared could be stolen at any second. Alan Brooks sat opposite them, his uniform immaculate as ever, his blonde hair combed into perfection even in the chaos of the ambulance. Yet the cold blue eyes that had once projected control now flickered nervously. He cleared his throat, his voice a calculated whisper. "We must proceed carefully. The press will have a field day if this becomes public. We need to contain the story until we know more." His tone was stern, but beneath it, Miller caught something else: fear, or perhaps guilt. Grace Mitchell rode in the second vehicle behind them, camera still clutched in her gloved hands, her green eyes reflecting the neon glow of the city through the frosted glass. At 45, hardened by years of chasing scandals, she had come to the funeral expecting little more than a headline about a grieving widow and a loyal dog. Instead, she now sat on the edge of a revelation that could rip Chicago's leadership apart. Her breath clouded the window as she muttered to herself, "If he was poisoned, then someone wanted him silenced, and someone still does." The ambulance screeched to a halt outside Northwestern Memorial Hospital, its bright facade strung with festive Christmas lights that glowed mockingly against the night. Inside, the hospital hummed with urgency. Dawson was rushed through glass doors, his gurney swallowed by the fluorescent light of sterile corridors. Nurses and doctors in pale scrubs surrounded him, their faces masks of calm efficiency, their hands moving in rehearsed precision. It was here that a new figure entered the picture: Dr. Matthew Levine, the attending emergency physician. Levine was in his early 50s, stocky, with a round face framed by a salt and pepper beard. His hazel eyes were kind but sharp, accustomed to long nights and the fragile line between life and death. His white coat hung loosely over navy scrubs, his steps brisk, his manner authoritative without arrogance. He glanced once at Dawson, then at Carter. "What do we have?" His voice was deep, steady. "Pulse weak but present," Carter replied, her tone clipped, precise. "Evidence of a toxin, likely something that suppresses respiration and heartbeat. We need toxicology immediately." Levine's brow furrowed, his hazel eyes narrowing. "A poison that mimics death," he murmured. "God help us." He gestured briskly to his team. "Get him to ICU. Keep him under continuous monitoring, and no one enters that room without my clearance." Sarah tried to follow, but Miller placed a hand gently on her arm, his square jaw softening as he met her tearful gaze. "Let them work, Sarah. He's in the best hands now." She nodded, trembling, her tall frame nearly buckling as she sank into a waiting room chair, Rex curling protectively at her feet. Meanwhile, Brooks pulled out his phone, his cold eyes darting as he typed furiously, his voice low into the receiver. Miller's sharp gaze lingered on him. There was no grief in Brooks's composure, only agitation, as though his mind was racing not about Dawson's survival, but about what it meant for him. Grace Mitchell slipped into the waiting room minutes later, her coat dusted with snow, her breathless green eyes searching the faces. She sat quietly in a corner, pretending to scroll her phone, but her ears tuned to every word. She noted the way Sarah whispered prayers, the way Miller stood guard like a soldier, and the way Brooks couldn't stop checking his watch. She smelled the story growing larger with every passing second. 2 hours passed in tense silence until Carter emerged, her rectangular glasses fogged, her lean frame stiff with fatigue. She addressed Miller first, her voice even but edged with urgency. "He's stable for now. Toxicology confirms tetrodotoxin derivative highly refined. It slows the body almost to a standstill, makes death appear certain. It's rare, and not something you'd find on the street." "Which means," Miller said, his jaw tightening, "this wasn't just an accident. This was deliberate. Someone wanted him buried alive." Sarah gasped softly, her pale face blanching. Rex growled low, as if echoing the suspicion. Carter adjusted her glasses, her voice quiet but firm. "This compound. It would take someone with resources, someone with connections to obtain it. Military labs, perhaps, or high-level criminal networks." Her eyes flicked toward Brooks for the briefest instant, and Miller caught it. Brooks stood abruptly, smoothing his coat. "Speculation is dangerous. Until we have proof, this stays contained. For the city's stability, for the department." His words carried authority, but his hands trembled slightly at his sides. Miller stepped closer, his voice dropping low. "Containment isn't about the city, Alan. It's about protecting someone. Who are you afraid we'll find out?" Before Brooks could answer, a sharp commotion broke out near the entrance. The glass doors banged open, icy wind sweeping in as uniformed security rushed forward. A nurse shouted, "Sir, you can't be in here!" But a man pushed past them, tall and broad-shouldered, wrapped in a heavy overcoat, his sharp jaw dusted with stubble, his piercing gray eyes scanning the room with military precision. This was Detective Mark Ramirez, newly arrived from a different division. At 34, Ramirez was younger than Miller, but carried himself with the confidence of a man who had already seen too much. His thick black hair was combed back, his expression firm, and his voice carried authority. "I was sent to secure the chief's room. Orders from higher up." Levine appeared immediately, his hazel eyes narrowed. "I don't care who sent you. No one gets near my patient without my clearance." The air grew taut, Miller studying Ramirez, Carter adjusting her glasses with suspicion, Sarah clutching Rex's leash tighter. Grace lifted her phone, quietly recording again. Ramirez met Miller's gaze, his gray eyes unflinching. "This isn't just about the chief. It's about the department. Someone doesn't want him alive. And if that someone is already here..." His words trailed off as his gaze slid toward Brooks, who stood rigid, lips pressed thin, cold blue eyes refusing to meet anyone's stare. The hospital seemed to hold its breath. Outside, snowflakes pressed against the glass, Christmas lights blinking cheerlessly against the dark. Inside, the fragile life of Robert Dawson beat softly on a monitor, the secret of his poisoning pulling everyone tighter into a web of suspicion. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, the power flickered. The lights above dimmed, monitors beeped erratically, and the emergency generator hummed faintly to life. The hospital fell into uneasy shadow. John Miller's hand instinctively moved to the holster under his coat. Rex's growl vibrated against the linoleum floor, and every eye turned toward the ICU doors as a shadow moved just beyond the frosted glass. The glow of Christmas lights still shimmered outside on Michigan Avenue, but inside the Chicago Police Department headquarters, the air was heavy with suspicion. The building, a gray slab of steel and concrete, seemed colder than the snow swirling around its steps. John Miller sat in the dimly lit operations room, his square jaw tight, blue-gray eyes fixed on the files scattered before him. The discovery of tetrodotoxin in Chief Dawson's body had blown open a door he wished had stayed closed. Every piece of paper, every photograph, hinted at something larger, a network of corruption Dawson had been chasing before he collapsed in his own home. The names had begun to surface: Judge Thomas Keene and Mayor William Harper. Keene was 60 years old, tall, gaunt, with thinning white hair and deep grooves running from his nose to his jaw, the kind of face that carried authority in a courtroom. He had built his reputation on stern rulings and an unflinching demeanor, though rumors whispered that behind closed doors his decisions bent easily when money changed hands. Mayor Harper, at 62, carried himself as the jovial patriarch of the city, round-faced, with thinning blonde hair and a smile designed for cameras. But the warmth was only surface. Miller had heard enough over the years to know Harper's easy charm hid a ruthless streak, a willingness to sacrifice anyone to preserve his own power. Dr. Elizabeth Carter leaned over the desk, her rectangular glasses sliding down her sharp nose as she reviewed the toxicology report again. "This wasn't an isolated act," she said, her voice low, deliberate. "The compound is too specialized, too rare. Someone supplied it. Someone powerful enough to make sure it reached Dawson without raising alarms." Her brown eyes, always steady, flicked toward Miller. "This goes higher than the deputy chief." Alan Brooks stood nearby, his blonde hair still immaculate, his cold blue eyes scanning the room like a predator calculating an escape. "Careful, Carter," he said smoothly, though his jaw muscles tightened beneath the veneer. "Accusing men like Keene and Harper without evidence will destroy this department. And it will destroy all of you." He buttoned his coat with methodical precision, a man trying to keep control as the walls shifted around him. Miller ignored him, his stubble catching the glow of the desk lamp as he bent forward. His voice was rough, weighted with suspicion. Dawson was planning to meet someone. He had files, evidence. If he was silenced, it's because he was close. Keene and Harper aren't just names on a list. They're part of this. His blue-gray eyes met Brooks's with a hardness that dared him to deny it. In the corner of the room, Grace Mitchell scrolled through the footage on her camera. She had returned to headquarters under the pretense of writing an early obituary draft, but in truth, she had more than words in her pocket. Her green eyes widened slightly as she replayed the grainy video she had found. The timestamp was the night before the funeral. The footage, taken from a side alley camera near St. Mary's, showed a tall figure in a dark overcoat slipping inside the funeral home long after staff had gone. His face was obscured, but his movements were purposeful, practiced. She muttered under her breath. So the coffin wasn't untouched after all. Sarah Dawson had been escorted into the room by Miller moments earlier, her tall frame wrapped in a long black coat, her auburn hair messy from sleepless nights. Her pale skin looked fragile under the fluorescent lights, but her hazel eyes burned with quiet determination. "Robert was worried," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. "The week before this happened, he told me not to trust anyone at City Hall. He said if anything happened to him, someone inside the department would try to bury the truth." Her hands shook as she clutched a rosary, a habit she had taken to in these sleepless nights. A knock interrupted the tense silence. A young officer stepped in. Officer Jenny Ramirez, a 28-year-old with short, dark hair tucked under her cap. Her round face flushed from the cold, and brown eyes bright with determination. Ramirez was new to homicide but carried herself with sincerity, her uniform crisp despite the long hours. She looked nervously at Miller. "Detective, we pulled the visitor log from the funeral home. Someone signed in late that night, using a false name. But security confirms the signature matched the hand of someone in our own department." Her voice cracked slightly, betraying both fear and resolve. Miller's stomach tightened. He glanced at Brooks, whose expression remained carved from stone. Rex, lying at Miller's feet, growled softly, his amber eyes fixed on the deputy chief. Grace shifted, raising her phone. "I think I can match the footage to that log," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. She swiped quickly, zooming in on the grainy silhouette. The figure's walk, the squared shoulders, the deliberate stride. She had seen it before. Her green eyes flicked up, settling on Brooks. "I don't need better resolution. I know who that is." Alan Brooks's jaw clenched. For a fleeting second, his composure cracked, his cold blue eyes flashing with anger before settling back into their polished calm. "Careful what you imply, Mitchell. A reporter's career can end quicker than it starts." Sarah stepped forward, her tall figure trembling, her hazel eyes wet with grief but sharpened with rage. "If you had anything to do with what happened to Robert, I swear." Her voice broke, tears cutting down her cheeks. Miller gently caught her arm, steadying her. Before anyone could respond, Dr. Carter straightened abruptly. "Quiet," she ordered. She had been listening to the faint hiss of the radio unit on the desk. Static crackled, then a broken voice cut through. "This is ICU. Code Black. Intruder." The line went dead. Everyone froze. Sarah gasped, clutching her rosary tighter. Grace's phone slipped slightly in her grip, her breath quickening. Miller's heart hammered against his ribs. Dawson was supposed to be safe in his hospital bed, but now... Brooks moved first, his voice clipped. "We need to move now. If someone's inside the ICU, then this isn't just about corruption. It's about finishing the job." Rex barked sharply, hackles raised, his body trembling with readiness. Miller grabbed his coat, eyes hard. "Then let's not give them what they came for." As they rushed from the operations room, Grace glanced one last time at the paused image on her screen. The silhouette slipping into the funeral home the night before. Her instincts told her she was staring at the same shadow that now walked the halls of the hospital. And somewhere across Chicago, the Christmas lights kept blinking cheerfully, masking the darkness coiled tighter around them all. The corridors of Northwestern Memorial Hospital smelled faintly of disinfectant and fear, a strange blend of sterility and human tension. Snow pressed against the tall glass windows, muffling the city's usual hum, while Christmas decorations still twinkled in the waiting areas, a cruel reminder of joy in a place now consumed by dread. John Miller walked quickly, his broad shoulders squared, his blue-gray eyes scanning every shadow. His stubbled jaw was locked tight, every muscle in his frame taut. At his side, Rex trotted with controlled energy, the 7-year-old German shepherd's thick sable coat rising along his back, his amber eyes alert to every flicker of movement. The warning from the radio, an intruder in the ICU, still echoed in Miller's mind. Sarah Dawson followed close behind, tall and slender in her long black coat, auburn hair falling in unkempt waves around her pale face. Her hazel eyes were clouded with grief, but beneath the sorrow was steel. She clutched her rosary like a weapon, whispering prayers under her breath as she walked. Every step carried the fear of losing her husband again, this time for good. They turned a corner to find Dr. Elizabeth Carter already there, her rectangular glasses reflecting the dim emergency lights, her dark hair pulled back tightly, her expression grim. "The ICU is on lockdown," she said, her voice sharp with authority. "But someone forced entry. Security is sweeping the wing." Before Miller could respond, Grace Mitchell arrived, her winter coat still damp from melted snow. Her green eyes gleamed with the thrill of the story, though her heart thudded with unease. She had smelled corruption, but this was something darker, a conspiracy crawling through the very walls of the city. She lifted her camera instinctively, though Miller shot her a glare that froze her hand. "Not now, Mitchell," he growled. "This isn't your courtroom headline. This is survival." The doors to the ICU burst open, 2 guards rushing out. One was clutching his side, blood staining his white shirt. The other, pale and shaking, stammered, We found her inside." "Her?" Miller demanded, his voice harsh, echoing off the sterile walls. And then, stepping into the dim corridor under the flicker of failing lights, came Linda Dawson. At 52, Linda bore some resemblance to her sister Sarah. Tall, with auburn hair now dulled with gray, her frame slimmer, almost gaunt. But where Sarah's hazel eyes carried warmth and resilience, Linda's were sharp, restless, darting like a cornered animal. Her makeup was smudged, her lips tight, and her trembling hands clutched a disposable coffee tray as though it were a shield. "Linda." Sarah's voice broke into disbelief, a mixture of horror and hope. "What are you doing here? Why are you in Robert's room?" Linda's eyes flicked toward Miller, then to the others. I just came to bring coffee. For the guards. For everyone." Waiting. "You know me, Sarah. You know I would never," her voice cracked, rising into a pitch that betrayed desperation. Rex growled low, stepping in front of Miller, hackles raised, ears pricked forward, his amber eyes fixed on Linda with unwavering intensity. Then he barked, sharp, insistent, the same bark he had given at the funeral. The sound tore through the hallway like a verdict. Sarah's rosary slipped from her fingers, clattering against the floor. Her hazel eyes widened as realization clawed at her. No, Linda. Tell me he's wrong." Miller's jaw tightened. He took a slow step forward, his square shoulders casting a shadow over Linda's trembling form. "Rex doesn't bark at shadows. He doesn't bark at grief. He barks at the truth. And right now, he's telling us you've been poisoning Robert." Linda's face drained of color. Her lips parted, but no words came, only the faintest whisper of denial. She backed away, her shoes squeaking on the polished floor. Dr. Carter spoke, her voice cutting through the silence. "The toxin, tetrodotoxin, was administered in small doses over time, not a single injection. A routine, a ritual. Coffee, tea, something he consumed daily. It matches perfectly. She glanced at the coffee tray still clutched in Linda's hands. Sarah staggered back, her tall frame trembling, one hand pressed against her mouth. Her hazel eyes filled with tears that streamed silently down her pale cheeks. You brought him coffee every morning, Linda. You said it was your way of helping, of showing you cared. How could you? Linda's mask cracked. Her voice turned sharp, bitter, her eyes flashing with something darker than guilt. Do you know what it's like, Sarah? To spend your life in your sister's shadow? You, the beloved wife, the teacher, the saint of the community. Robert, the noble chief, adored by the city. And me? Nothing. Invisible. Always on the outside looking in, until Judge Keene showed me another way. He promised me a place. He promised money, respect, a life where I wasn't the forgotten Dawson. Her words tumbled out, venom mixed with desperation. Miller's fists clenched at his sides. His voice came out low, controlled, but edged with fury. So you poisoned your own brother-in-law for power? You almost buried him alive. And for what? A judge's promises? Linda's lips trembled. I didn't know it would go this far. Keene said it would only make him weak, force him to retire, step aside. But then the doses increased, the instructions changed, and I couldn't back out. They had me trapped. They threatened me. They threatened my son. Sarah's voice turned sharp, steel cutting through grief. You had a choice, Linda, and you chose betrayal. Rex barked again, his deep chest vibrating with fury, his amber eyes locked on Linda as if daring her to lie once more. Alan Brooks finally appeared, his blonde hair gleaming even in the dim light, his cold blue eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. He clapped his hands once, slow and deliberate. Touching, he said with a smirk that sent a chill down the hallway. But the family drama doesn't change the fact that you have no evidence admissible in court. A dog's bark and a confession said in anger? It'll never hold. His polished voice carried the slick confidence of a man who believed he still controlled the game. Miller turned to him, fury flaring in his blue-gray eyes. Maybe not yet, but it's enough to start pulling every thread. And I promise you, Brooks, when I'm done, there won't be a piece of your empire left to hide behind. Brooks's smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second, but then he straightened, his politician's smile returning. Careful, Miller. Push too hard, and you might not make it through the night. The hallway fell silent, the Christmas lights outside casting distorted reflections through the frosted glass. Sarah sank to her knees, her tall frame folding under the weight of betrayal, whispering her sister's name through tears. Grace Mitchell's camera was rolling again, her green eyes wide, knowing this footage would shake the city to its core if she dared release it. Dr. Carter pressed her lips together, her mind racing with the medical evidence she could turn into testimony. And then the ICU alarm blared, shrill and merciless. Nurses rushed past, shouting over one another. Dawson's monitors were screaming inside the room. Miller spun, Rex barking furiously as the doors slammed shut. For one breathless moment, it was impossible to tell if Robert Dawson was clinging to life or if the betrayal had finally taken him. The snow had thickened over Chicago, swirling through the streets in relentless waves as church bells rang faintly from somewhere downtown. The city, wrapped in festive lights and holiday music, seemed unaware of the battle unfolding within its own veins. At Northwestern Memorial Hospital, the alarms in the ICU had finally stilled, leaving only the rhythmic beep of machines and the heavy breathing of exhausted staff. Chief Robert Dawson still lay unconscious, but the storm of betrayal and corruption around him had reached its breaking point. John Miller stood in the corner of the ICU, broad shoulders slumped, but his sharp blue-gray eyes alert. His square jaw was shadowed with stubble, his tall frame weary yet grounded like a soldier unwilling to fall. He had spent hours pushing back rage and fatigue, holding on to one truth. Dawson lived, and that meant the fight was not yet over. Rex lay at his feet, the German shepherd's amber eyes half closed, but ears twitching at every sound. His body bruised from restless hours, but his loyalty unshaken. The dog was a symbol now, not only of instinct, but of survival, a witness no one could silence. Sarah Dawson sat beside her husband's bed, her tall, slender frame bent forward, auburn hair falling like a curtain around her pale, grief-lined face. Her hazel eyes stared at Robert's motionless hand, clinging to it as if her touch alone could anchor him to the world. Her voice was hoarse from whispered prayers, and yet there was strength in the way she refused to leave his side. The door opened with a rush of cold air, and Grace Mitchell entered, her winter coat flung back, her green eyes sharp with the fever of revelation. The journalist held her camera in one hand and a slim laptop in the other. Her breath came quick, clouding in the chilled room, but her words were precise. "I have the files," she said, her voice echoing off the sterile walls. Dawson hid them in his uniform jacket, a microdrive sewn into the lining. He prepared for this. He knew it might come. Miller straightened, his stubbled jaw tightening. "What's on them?" Grace set the laptop on a table, fingers flying across the keys. The screen flickered, and then lines of financial records, surveillance images, and transcripts filled the display. "Judge Thomas Keene, Mayor William Harper," she said, her green eyes darting across the evidence. "Payments from cartel-linked shell companies, phone records connecting them directly to Alan Brooks. It's airtight." As if summoned by his own name, Alan Brooks had already vanished from the hospital hours earlier, slipping through shadows with the precision of a man who had prepared his escape long before. But now, the weight of evidence was crashing down around him. Miller clenched his fists, jaw tightening. He won't run far. Men like Brooks believe they can outsmart everyone. That arrogance will get him caught. Dr. Matthew Levine entered, his round face drawn with fatigue, hazel eyes heavy but still sharp. His salt and pepper beard bristled as he glanced at Dawson's monitors. "He's stable, but recovery will be long. The poison left scars. He'll need months before he's strong again, if he chooses to return at all." His words hung in the room like the snow pressing against the windows. Grace closed the laptop with a decisive snap. "I've already sent copies of the files to my editor, but I'm holding the story for now. This isn't just about exposure. It's about survival. If Brooks knows this is out, he'll get desperate. We need to time it right." Hours later, the news broke not from Grace but from the FBI. Special Agent Thomas Reynolds arrived at headquarters in a black overcoat, silver hair slicked back, his lean face carved with lines of experience. His dark eyes scanned the precinct like a hawk. "We have enough to move," he said in a low voice. "Operation Lockdown starts tonight. Judge Keene, Mayor Harper, and any associates, we strike all at once." His tone was cold, efficient, leaving no room for doubt. The raids spread across Chicago in a storm as fierce as the snow outside. Black SUVs screeched through slush-covered streets, agents in dark jackets storming courthouse offices and mayoral chambers. Judge Keene, gaunt and pale, was found in his home office, his thin fingers trembling as he reached for a glass of bourbon, his eyes wide with disbelief as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Mayor Harper was dragged from a gala at the city's downtown ballroom, his round face collapsing into a mask of panic as flashing cameras captured his downfall. Alan Brooks was the hardest to catch. For 2 days he eluded pursuit, slipping through alleys and safe houses, his cold blue eyes narrowing at every shadow. But arrogance, as Miller had predicted, betrayed him. On the third night, he attempted to cross into Indiana under a false identity, his blonde hair hidden beneath a cap, his politician's smile twisted into desperation. FBI agents closed in on the rest stop, where he tried to bribe a truck driver for passage. When they surrounded him, Brooks finally dropped the mask, his voice filled with venom. "You think this ends with me? You have no idea how deep it goes." But the cuffs still closed, and the empire he thought unshakable crumbled under the falling snow. At the hospital, Sarah held Robert's hand as news of the arrests filtered in. Tears glistened in her hazel eyes, but this time they were not from despair. "You did it, Robert," she whispered. "Even lying here, you brought them down." Her tall frame leaned over the bed, auburn hair brushing her husband's motionless arm, as if willing him to hear. Rex barked softly, tail thumping against the floor, as though he too understood the weight of the moment. Nurses and officers alike reached down to pat his thick fur. The German shepherd had become more than a companion. He was the city's silent guardian, the reason the coffin had been opened, the reason Dawson had been saved. The following week, the city gathered in the snow-covered square before City Hall. Bells rang across downtown Chicago, echoing over the frozen river as the interim leadership addressed the people. John Miller, broad-shouldered and steady, stood in uniform at the podium. His blue-gray eyes were weary but unbroken, his stubbled jaw set in determination. "Chief Dawson will need time to recover," he told the crowd. "But his fight continues in all of us. This department will be rebuilt, not on corruption, but on loyalty, justice, and truth." The crowd erupted in applause, their breath visible in the frigid air. Behind him, Sarah Dawson stood tall, auburn hair glinting under the winter sun, her hazel eyes steady with pride and sorrow. Grace Mitchell, her green eyes fierce, captured the moment on her camera, already drafting the headline that would mark a new beginning for Chicago. At Miller's side sat Rex, regal in his stance, a medal gleaming against his thick coat. The dog's amber eyes scanned the crowd, his ears pricked, as though still searching for threats hidden beneath the cheer. The people cheered louder for him than for any politician that day. Snowflakes drifted slowly from the gray sky, dusting the uniforms of officers who stood shoulder to shoulder, reclaiming their honor. The bells of St. Mary's tolled again, no longer a dirge for a man nearly buried alive, but a hymn of rebirth for a city scarred by betrayal. And as the bells rang into the snowy night, John Miller looked out across the city he had sworn to protect, his heart heavy yet hopeful. Justice had been served, but the war against shadows was far from over.